this channel and make it available pursuant to franchise agreements with the communities we serve. Comcast is not affiliated with the following program or the producers of public access programming and is not responsible for the content. The following program does not reflect the opinions of Comcast or its affiliates.
Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. Lending and the credit crisis have been in the news quite a lot lately. Tonight we'll be talking about the lending practice, but from a slightly different perspective. We're going to talk about the subject of Islamic finance. And our guest tonight is Mr. Fawad, an expert in Islamic finance. Fawad, pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure to be here, Kevin.
Well, let's start with the basics. People hear the term Islamic finance, and they have no idea what that means or why it's necessary. So let's start with the basics. What is it?
Islamic finance is essentially a set of principles by which most of the Muslim community around the world wants its products to be delivered to them. There are a few fundamental principles that are part of Islamic finance. One of them is the fact that you cannot pay or receive interest. As you can imagine, that creates a lot of challenges in the Western banking environment.
In the lending industry, which is based on interest income, that
Absolutely.
is something of a problem.
Absolutely. So you know, I think the simplest way to answer that is that it's a set of principles for the Muslim community to comply with their religious beliefs, but also be able to participate in the financial markets.
Well, so how does it work? If you can't charge interest, how does the lender make money?
Well, I think, you know, so the concepts are based on assets. There is no, money has no value per se in the Islamic or the Sharia law. Things have value. So in terms of making money off of money, it's not allowed because money shouldn't really have any value. But you can make money off of things. So the way it typically works is that in a Sharia compliant financial instrument or an Islamic financial loan, the bank actually ends up owning the property that the individual wants to live in and then renting that out to them over a 30-year period, for example, at the end of which the buyer or the renter becomes the homeowner for a small fee or ultimately you know, is given title once the bank's made up the money that it wants to make.
Of course, you could argue that even in the Western financial system, the bank owns the property anyway.
I think the difference is, you know, so it's a subtle. You actually bring a very interesting point, Kevin. That's a subtle difference in terms of ownership in real terms and ownership in conceptual terms. But that subtle difference is important in Islamic finance. The fact that the bank owns the title in that scenario is important because the bank has to be a participant in both risk and reward.
Now, is the homeowner, and I'm not even sure that's the right word in this case, the person who takes out the Sharia-compliant loan, is that person also on the title?
No, they're not. They don't own the place until they've paid it off. Until then, they're actually purely renters.
Interesting. So from their perspective, their situation hasn't changed. If they were renting before, they're renting now.
Right.
The only difference is that at the end of some rental period, they own.
That's correct. I mean, there's a pathway to ownership. In terms of, you know, it defines the pathway. Both of the parties agree to what that path is, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. And at the end of that path, the ownership actually occurs. So you have to spend the time, you have to pay in a lot of money in terms of rent before you become the owner.
Now, what happens if someone sells the property 10 years into a 30-year loan?
Right. So, I mean, it depends on which model you're using. There are about 3 different models out there. One of it is called musharaka, which means joint ownership. One of them is called murabaha, which is cost plus. And the third one is called ijara. Ijara actually literally means leasing. So depending on which model you've subscribed to, different results occur. In a typical ijara model where you're leasing the property until you are the owner.
Is that the most common?
It is one of the more common ones. Murabaha and ijara are the two most common instruments used in the U.S. and around the world. Musharaka is the most preferred one by Islamic thought leaders, but it's harder to implement. That's a situation where both parties put in equal amounts of money and have equal amounts of ownership, and you can see how that could be a challenge in this environment. But in Ijara, if you're in a leasing environment, you're not owners until you've paid that off. And if somebody sells the property halfway through, which means the bank sells the property halfway through, the bank actually gets the profit. Now, you do have some profit sharing agreements that you can put in place, and some of the banks do. In the cost plus model, which is Murabha, it's a slightly different transaction. So in a pure conceptual way, in a pure Islamic financial system, which, by the way, doesn't exist anywhere in the world today.
There's very few pure systems in the world.
Agreed.
Anyway, right?
So which is under development as a result of some of the activity that's occurred in the last 10 years, but it doesn't exist today. What you'll see with most of the Islamic financial models, especially in the Western Hemisphere, is that they've kind of been retrofitted on top of the Western financial system. Because there are a tremendous amount of regulations that have taken hundreds of years in the U.S. markets to develop, you can't just throw them out. The Federal Reserve won't allow it, the FDIC won't allow it, and other regulators that are responsible for it won't allow it. So it's important to slowly penetrate this market and serve the community, but ultimately come to that system which is better than where it is today, perhaps still not pure.
Well, interestingly, before the show, you had mentioned that the concept of Islamic finance is fairly new. It's only been around 10 years or so. And a couple of questions come out of that. One is, certainly the concept of not paying interest has been in Islam since the founding in 600 AD.
It's about around that time.
So that's very old. Why has it taken until 10 years ago to develop this concept? And then the follow-up question will be, given that it's only 10 years, where is it in its lifespan?
I think, I think if I was to, let me answer the first question first. I think Islam has been around for a really long time, and the way transactions take place between individuals and entities has been defined ever since then. In the beginning, the financial model was thought about and as delivered in Quran and other holy books, but the implementation, was never there. And in all honesty, if you look at the Islamic history, there has never been a time where the Islamic finance model was fully implemented. And I think some of it had to do with the fact that Islam was a new religion. It was trying to deal with larger issues at that point rather than finance. But over the last 20 years, I would say, the shift has started to occur.
Well, have there been other models prior to this most recent one? When you say it's never been fully implemented, were there other attempts in previous centuries?
Yes, there were. So most of the models that existed prior to this had to do with the goodwill of individuals. So, for example, there are models that are even leveraged today in some of South Asian countries where if a family member wanted to acquire an asset of some sort, other family members would pitch in and put together a pool, a fund, which would be interest-free. So it was more, since you couldn't charge interest and you couldn't pay interest, you sort of had to use either the standard models of joint ownership where you could put in whatever money you had, another party would put in that, or you sort of had to depend on the generosity of friends and family.
So let me come back to a central concept, though, of Islam, and that is that interest shouldn't be charged. And I'm curious about why that came about. What's the historical picture behind that?
So the reality is that it's to reduce